So for the Russians to move into offensive operations in the north while still trying to retain the defensive capability and in the south and hold firm in the south wouldn't be easy. So although they are rebuilding 18 and 25 Command Arms Army, and they could be used for some sort of offensive in the north, it doesn't have to be a major counteroffensive. It could just be a relatively small offensive aimed at securing a patch of turf or a particular city or whatever.
Could I just firstly get your reaction to the death of Prigozhin last night?
Yeah, I suspect, like everybody else, it was hardly a surprise, to be honest. And I don't say that glibly, but in these sort of dictatorships, anybody who dares to speak out is putting themselves in danger. And he did a lot of that. So I don't think it was a surprise. I think my understanding is we're still only about 80 or 90% certain that he died, that he was on the plane. But it looks like about 10 people died, including the founder of Wagner and also one of the deputies who was a senior finance and I think logistics guy. And some time ago, they lost their second in command, who basically walked away, I think. So the bottom line is, if he has died along with these other guys, this has taken the head off Wagner. And the question is, what happens? What happens now? Now, you'll remember that the coup, in inverted commas, if it was ever going to be a coup, was all about the fact that the Russian MOD and the defense secretary were not giving Wagner sufficient equipment, particularly ammunition, and that the campaign was going very badly, and so on. And part of that was that the Russian MOD wanted to take Wagner back under their control. So one of the questions I think that's floating around at the moment is, will they then try and do that whilst the head has been taken off this organization? I think probably they will struggle to do that, if I'm honest. But then the repercussions for places like Africa, which of course they're quite strong in, and one or two other areas. So there's a lot of questions, but I don't think it's much of a surprise that this has happened.
Yeah, we're definitely left with a lot of questions that need to be answered. I mean, obviously, when we think about who killed Prigozhin, Putin's maybe at the top of that list, if we can believe these Russian reports. But who do you think might be behind this?
Well, I mean, clearly I don't know is the truth. Neither does anybody else, really. I think there'll be very senior players within the Russian military and the MOD who will be glad to see the back of him. We must be, well, fair is not the right word, but we must acknowledge that Wagner had been a key part in this campaign, and they have done some really hard fighting, which again is why they were so upset with the way that they were being treated. But ultimately, in this sort of regime, I have to say that I can't believe anybody will have done this without Putin's authority. I mean, at the end of the day, as we know, this guy started as a chef, was Putin's man. They knew each other. One could say they were friends, if you can be friends in that sort of organization. So I just can't believe it will have been done without Putin being aware of it and giving his thumbs up.
Mm. And where does this leave the Wagner group? I mean, could we see Wagner fighters? There's reports of them. They've been actually kind of crying out at the death of their leader in St. Petersburg. Where does it leave those fighters?
Well, he was a popular guy within the Wagner group, and they were well paid. Compared to the average Russian soldier, these guys were well paid. They were mercenaries, effectively, but some of them have been there working there for a long time. So, and they will have been saddened to see him go. He, like men of his style, he gathered around him people who liked his style. They liked his robustness and his roughness and his preparedness to speak out, and so on. And in terms of leadership, whether we like it much or not, that is a powerful strand of leadership. It's not the best strand in many ways, but that's what it is. So these guys will individually will have to be considering what they do now. I suspect, they won't all rush to judgment on what to do next. They'll wait and see how this thing develops over the next few days. Whether they will all stay, is questionable. But they will want to know. I mean, ultimately, as a foot soldier, and I know I retired as a general, but all senior officers, I know the media like to have a crack about senior officers, but we all start as junior officers, and we all start, at the lowest level. What you want are people who care about you, understand what they're trying to achieve, are good at strategic thinking and pulling this whole thing together, and lead you powerfully and strongly to success. They will want to feel that whoever takes over is going to be in that mold. And I don't know who's going to take over, to be frank. we'll have to wait and see.
Mm. And Prigozhin wasn't just popular amongst his own fighters. He was also, quite well received, honestly, when he launched his march on Moscow in June, when he was in southern Russia. I mean, could this cause some kind of discontent in Russia or maybe even in the Russian military?
I doubt it. It's the truth. I mean, it's a fair question, but there's that old saying that nations endure, regimes collapse. And, what brings about the collapse of regimes is always pretty difficult to put your finger on. Obviously, at the end of the Cold War, the old Soviet Union collapsed relatively quickly, and places, some of the dictatorships in Eastern Europe collapsed almost overnight. So anything is possible, but I'm not convinced that this is going to result in some sort of popular uprising or anything. I mean, he was welcomed in those places, and I think a lot of people in that part of Russia, close to the Ukrainian border, were pretty jarred off with the way things were going. And Moscow is, of course, being hit by drone attacks, and the war is being taken to Moscow. The attack on the airfields with the 5 fighters and the Tupolev that was also destroyed. But these are relatively small things. I mean, they're not psychologically unimportant, but in the context of the strategic campaign for what Ukraine is trying to do in terms of pushing Russia out, and what Russia is trying to do in terms of its original aims are still on the table. These are relatively small things. And I just don't think that there is an appetite within Russia to overthrow the regime. And I don't think this will be the catalyst for it. I may be wrong, but that's my gut instinct.
So you don't think that this will backfire on Putin?
No. I mean, Putin is what he is. he's a brutal dictator. Right, and I don't want to be simplistic about this, but Russia traditionally, likes strong leadership. It is what it is as a nation. It's the way that it's been throughout history, really. So in a way, I think that there'll be a fair cohort of people who think this is a jolly good thing, that he stood up against the regime, that he was aggressive, that he went public, he tried a coup and so forth. So therefore, he's brought this upon himself. There'll be definitely a very strong view about that. And even for those who don't like it much, the Russians, they, as we know from Salisbury and places, they are in the business of taking people out they don't like much. And there's not many people in Russia who fundamentally, I mean, there will be lots, obviously, in terms of individual people and their own religious beliefs and so forth, who don't like it much. But Russia overall, I don't think will regret this.
And I mean, Putin, he's got this kind of Wagner problem now of, what happens to the Wagner group and who's going to lead it and will it become part of the Russian MOD? But also there's the Surovikin problem, because we've recently heard that he's also now leaving his post. These are 2 really big shoes to fill. I mean, you might not know exactly who Putin will replace them with, but what kind of characters could we see coming about?
Well, the first point is that he went because of his sympathy with the rebellion, in inverted commas. I mean, some people say he's still involved in some way with the Air Force, but basically he was sacked because he gave pretty overt support, to that move. Now, we are well into this campaign. I mean, it's 500. I mean, you'll know this, but it's 546 days since this campaign started, and it is the anniversary, of course, of the Independence Day. Now, we fought World War II, took us 5 years. We went through a lot of senior officers. I mean, a lot of senior officers. We didn't win a single battle or campaign until November 1942, 3 years after the war started. And that was the Battle of El Alamein. Everywhere else we'd lost. We'd been kicked out of, France and the Low Countries and places like Norway and so on. We'd had complete reverses in Africa, etc., etc. So my point is that the changing senior military is not unusual in any campaign. And what, Putin has changed a lot of his senior generals in this last year. Initially, the cohort who failed to achieve what he wanted them to achieve in the early days. But actually, in the current context, the Ukrainian counteroffensive is not going well. I mean, people are talking it up, and I understand why. But when we start talking about strategic villages, I mean, we're losing the plot here. These are relatively very small gains. I mean, there are some gains, but they're relatively very small. The Russian defenses are very strong. And I think what we're seeing is, I don't want to be gloomy about this, but I think we must be realistic. We're seeing a point in this campaign where the counteroffensive isn't working. The weather's going to be changing relatively soon. The Ukrainian hope to break through and then conduct maneuver warfare and press on to secure the Azov Sea and the routes into Crimea, etc. That isn't happening. I mean, it might, tomorrow morning we might make up with something different. Who knows? But, you know, that's not apparently happening. So the Russians are in a much stronger position here, and they have a vote. The enemy has a vote in these things. So what will Putin be looking for? He's looking for a solid guy who's going to be capable of pulling the Russian Air Force together, who overall, it has to be said, haven't performed well. But, and it's a big but, the Ukrainian Air Force, of course, is tiny. I mean, it is not a big Air Force. Somebody once said it's like a small duvet trying to cover a giant king-size bed. It's got a long front. It's trying to use its resources as best it can. But, you know, when we tried to break out of Normandy in 1944, after the D-Day landings in Operation Goodwood, it took us a long time, we, the Brits and Canadians and the Americans were on the other flank, but for us in particular, retaking Caen and so forth, took us a long time. And we had massive air supremacy, not just air superiority, but massive air supremacy. Ukraine doesn't have that. So what Putin wants is somebody who's going to take control of the Air Force and use it to best effect in counter-air operations, and, you know, winning and maintaining and securing air supremacy over the whole of the battlefront. And I don't know who that will be, frankly, and whether anybody is capable of that, I don't know. But nonetheless, the last guy, in my understanding, is the last guy wasn't sacked because he wasn't a good Air Force commander. He was sacked because of the decision to stand by the rebellion.
But you don't think that, do you not think the F-16s will make much of a difference that we see that the US and the Netherlands gave Ukraine? I think it was last week.
Well, gave is not the right word, actually. Are giving, and there's a total of about 48 of them, I think. I mean, what's happened is the Americans have given permission for the F-16s to be given to Ukraine, because ultimately they hold the, you know, the trump card, in inverted commas. Using Trump's name is probably not the right word, but nonetheless they hold the card, whether or not this is going to be released. Now these airplanes have to be, you know, sorted out, given over. Pilots have to be trained, and like all of these equipments that the West have been giving, it's not just a matter of handing over a bit of kit. You know, you have to be able to operate the bases from which they fly from. You have to be able to sustain them and maintain them in terms of airworthiness and so on. And you need, you know, capable engineers to do that. And in terms of the amount of time this is going to take to come together, I've heard everything from the end of this year, which I think is a bit optimistic, but certainly next spring. I'm even hearing comments about not till next autumn. So there aren't that many of them. That's not, I don't want to underestimate, you know, that will make a significant, it will help significantly, but it's not going to suddenly create air supremacy for the Ukrainians. And B, it is going to take a long time to bring them into play. So like all the other Western equipment, whether it's Challengers or Marder or Leopard or the Bradley, you know, vehicles that the Americans have given, they are making a difference, but nonetheless, they're just not of sufficient critical mass to make that, I think, you know, to really swing the balance. This critical mass is quite difficult to define. It's not just about numbers, but it is about the things I've talked about. It's about the logistics, sustainability, the technology to understand how to use it, repair it, and of course, to be able to fight it. And one of the things for me, for the Ukrainian side, is that we have trained, and others have trained a lot of Ukrainian infantry and relatively low-level, you know, NCOs and so on, in tactical level operations, how to operate on a battlefield. In this campaign, the key level of operation is the operational level. It's the brigade and divisional commanders who need to understand how to use all this stuff that we're giving them. Now, I don't know enough about the Ukrainian military, and I know enough to know they've done a pretty powerful job so far. But my instinct is they're versed in Warsaw Pact oblique Russian tactics and operational level capability, how to fight, and so forth. They're not using this stuff in the way that we in the West would use it. Now, you know, they can learn and change, but we put our senior officers through quite serious, well, very serious staff training and understanding before they become brigade commanders and divisional commanders. The High Commander Staff Course, the other staff courses that we run, as well as, of course, having had people who've grown into those roles from having commanded battle groups and, you know, divisions or battle groups and battalions and so forth with all of that equipment. So again, it takes time. And one of the issues over all of this is, did they start the counteroffensive too early because they weren't really ready for it? There's a lot of international pressure for that and a lot of internal pressure. So, there's always lots of ifs and ands and buts. But my comment is that, yes, it's important. It will take time to bring this to bear, sustaining them and maintaining them and understanding how to use them at the operational level to support ground operations, with combined arms, artillery, engineers, logistics, communications, and so forth, is not easy. And I'm not convinced at the moment that it's being handled, as well as we would hope, let's say.
And you've used World War II to kind of compare the current situation that we're in. I mean, in World War II took, what, 5 years?
Yeah, 39 to 45. Unless you're Americans, then it's shorter.
But what's a battle or a stage in the war in World War II that you could maybe compare where we are now for our viewers?
Yeah.
Do you see this kind of taking a similar amount of time?
Well, it's there's always a danger, particularly with Khrushchev generals who retired a few years ago, to start comparing what's going on now to what happened, 70 years ago, 80 years ago. But first point to make is that wars are always going to be over by Christmas. And I can remember having interviews back, 200 days ago saying, do not assume this thing's going to be over quickly. And I am attending, various briefings and reading various stuff. It's quite clear in my mind, people are already talking about next year's offensive and next year's operations and rebuilding. This is not the final throw of the dice for the Ukrainians, this current offensive, but it's fairly soon, the weather's going to turn. You either then wait for frozen conditions to continue some sort of offensive, or you wait for the spring and you're into another year. And of course, as I said earlier, the Russians have a vote here. They're not just going to sit back and do nothing. So I can't see this ending quickly. I never have been able to see it ending quickly. I can't see how the negotiations will end. Now, in military parlance, we talk about centers of gravity. What is the key critical moment where something, things change, the balance moves? I remember at Sandhurst, never mind about World War II, but I remember at Sandhurst back in 1969 doing a project on the Battle of Kursk. And you'll know that there's just been a meeting with the Russians at Kursk. With the Ukrainians at Kursk. And, some people defined, and I argued, that Kursk was a defining moment. That, after that, the Germans had never had the ability to conduct major offensives again in the East. Other people argue it was Stalingrad. So some people argue that a particular battle is the center of gravity. Others argue that it's a person, like a Stalin or a Hitler or a Churchill. Others argue that it's a particular time and space of something that's been going on, not just in terms of the battlefield, but in terms of the politics. So in that latter point, for example, interesting listening to the US debate last night, what were these candidates' views on Ukraine? Well, the Republicans as a whole, will they continue to support in the same way for the next year, 2, 3 years? There's clear indications that some of them don't think that's the right thing to do. So the critical time could be the war going on till next year, the November elections in America, a new president, and then a change in the political environment. There's a NATO summit in October that's coming up, and I don't know what will come out of that. I suspect we'll have the normal, voices saying we're going to continue with this, we'll support Ukraine, as long as it takes, etc., etc. But there are lots of opinions inside this debate that, as alluded to earlier, the Germans have been saying, come in for some criticism for saying it, but saying that they don't think the Ukrainians are using the kit particularly well. Others who are saying they're going to have to negotiate, and Zelensky saying that he's going to retake Crimea and retake the whole of the lost territories is just not going to happen. So there is definitely a view that there will have to be some sort of negotiated settlement to this, and if there isn't, then we go back full circle. It's difficult to see how it's going to come to an end militarily. It could change. So things can always change quickly, but nonetheless, my instinct is we're talking here still about years, and not years, not months or days, and we're talking about something that's going to happen to create that critical change. The critical mass may change. What is the center of gravity of this? Could it be a particular campaign, a particular battle, or could it be a change in the politics and the economic situation. I mean, we shouldn't forget Ukraine is almost bankrupt. So, how long can they continue the fight? And there's lots of, although the votes are very clear and the Ukrainian people are very clear that they want to join NATO and they want to succeed in this campaign, the numbers, lining up to join up is not what it was a year ago. So how long does the internal business in Ukraine hold firm? I think Zelensky's doing a fantastic job. So, I don't think that's an immediate danger. So there's all sorts of lines of operation here that, it's difficult to play against one another. I just feel for the moment, this is, we're in a sort of static environment. Well, static is the wrong word because there's a lot of fighting going on, but, we're not seeing any major changes on the battlefield, and we're not seeing any major changes in terms of the ability of Ukraine to rebuild. The Russians are rebuilding their reserves, as we said. I mean, 18th and 25 Combined Arms Army are coming together, probably not fully manned and equipped yet, but they have enormous reserves, Russia, compared to Ukraine. So lots can change.
To be fair, though, we did see overnight that Ukraine conducted a raid on Crimea where they planted a Ukrainian flag. You could say maybe that was pre-planned, or maybe they were kind of taking advantage of the whole Prigozhin of it all. I mean, it is a much slower offensive than we were seeing maybe this time last year, and maybe our kind of gauge for what we're expecting is just really high, but they are doing something.
Yeah, and don't misunderstand me. I mean, this is a serious and sensible conversation. We're not just trying to create short-term headlines here. This is an important conversation. And as I've said many times, both on Times Radio and elsewhere, one of the key factors in any military campaign is what we call the moral component of fighting power. The physical component is the stuff, the aeroplanes, the tanks, etc., and the ability to sustain them. The conceptual component is what I was alluding to earlier in terms of the operational level. Do you know how to use this stuff in maneuver warfare as opposed to attritional warfare? And it's no doubt the Ukrainians are, sadly, are still having to conduct a pretty attritional battle and are taking lots of casualties. And those two things are very important. But the key issue is the moral component of fighting power. It's the leadership. It's difficult words to pin down, but words in terms of the will to fight and the will to win on the battlefield. And the Ukrainians have had that in spades, and they have definitely had it, much more so than the Russians, particularly in those early months. So you're absolutely right. There's no sense of the Ukrainians collapsing at the moment, and there's no sense that they're not prepared to continue this fight. But actually conducting a special force operation into somewhere like the Crimea and planting a flag, that's important because of the moral component, not because of the physical component. It's not going to make a slice of difference in terms of the, whether they're going to retake Crimea or not, but it sends a very important message to both the Ukrainians and, of course, to the Russians. And ultimately, in the moral component is what will be decisive in this, I think. I mean, obviously, the military battles are pretty important too. But, we only need to look back in history. I mean, the Viet Cong defeated America. America had shed loads of stuff and shed loads of people. They didn't fight a particularly strong campaign, but they never lost a tactical battle on the battlefield. They lost because at home, the whole thing just fell apart. And that is true in many other military campaigns. So you're right. The Ukrainians are doing some good stuff, and they're fighting hard, and they're taking casualties, and they're holding firm. And we should not, I'm certainly not saying that we should in any sense abandon supporting them or continue to support them for as long as it takes. I powerfully believe that. But I just think we have to be honest and realistic about what is happening and not convince ourselves that some village in the east of Ukraine is going to become strategically, the moment, or that everything is going well. We just have to be honest about that. And therefore, in these NATO meetings and elsewhere, more importantly, between MODs and in conversations between the militaries, how can we help them better prepare and better conduct these operations that will bring about the success that we all hope that it will?
Yeah, and I appreciate this is a really sobering but a very important conversation to have about where the war is. And Mark Galeotti wrote in the Times, I think it was this weekend or last weekend, that the war won't be over by Christmas, but Ukraine is winning, but it's definitely been a struggle. And you signaled that maybe this winter is going to be really tough. I mean, we've chatted with other analysts here on this channel that, maybe Ukraine and Russia can't get through another winter of fighting. I mean, from your experience, do you think that we could expect some kind of big advance, some kind of last push before the winter starts this autumn? Should we be looking for something like that?
My instinct is no. I'll come back to one of the other points in a moment, but I think this counteroffensive that the Ukrainians launched, that is what it is. It is. They're not going to. They haven't reached, again, to use military jargon, they haven't reached a culminating point where they have to stop. They might, because of casualties, apart from anything else, to be honest, and things like ammunition, particularly artillery ammunition. And because they haven't got the air superiority, never mind about supremacy, they're using obviously a lot of artillery, missiles, drones attacks, and so on. And I know the Americans are giving them cluster weapons and so on, and we're everybody's providing ammunition. But that could be something that says we have to stop, we have to pause, draw up our strings, get ourselves sorted, get our logistics sorted, and so on. When you conduct this sort of campaign, if you go back to Iraq in 1991, which I was part of 1st Armored Division under Rupert Smith, there were 3 things that could have happened. One is, as we tried to break our way into Iraq, we could have had a battle on the border between Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, sorry, not Kuwait, Saudi Arabia and Iraq. So you have a fight to break in. We could have broken in quite quickly, and then had some sort of meeting engagement with the Iraqi Guard force, and a big battle after about, let's say, a couple of 100 miles. And the third option was you break through relatively quickly, and it's a pursuit, and you pursue the enemy in the Iraqis in this case a long way. Now those were the 3 options, and there are big differences. If you're having to fight your way in, that sucks in ammunition and so forth. If you're having to pursue over long distances, that's all about fuel and sustaining, being able to maintain your armored vehicles and so on. What we've seen here is that they might not have wanted it. They wanted one of those earlier options, but the Ukrainians are having to fight that option 1. They're still trying to fight their way in to break through what are very strong Russian defenses, minefields and anti-tank ditches and all that stuff. So they're having to, get stuck into that. So therefore, why would they stop and then try and restart again this side of the autumn? I don't think there's a space, the time to do that. So the only other question is, would the Russians conduct some sort of counteroffensive in the north, for example? And that's a possibility. But as we know, and as again I've certainly talked about a fair bit on these sort of interviews, as we're seeing the reality, conducting defensive operations is a very different business to conducting offensive operations. It's not easy, but it's easier. The old maxim that you need 3-to-1 advantage if you're on the attack, so you need a battalion to take out a company position or a brigade to take out a battalion position is so. So for the Russians to move into offensive operations in the north while still trying to retain the defensive capability and in the south and hold firm in the south wouldn't be easy. So although they are rebuilding 18 and 25 Command Arms Army, and they could be used for some sort of offensive in the north, it doesn't have to be a major counteroffensive. It could just be a relatively small offensive aimed at securing a patch of turf or a particular city or whatever, or just to put the pressure back on the Ukrainians. But either way, this side of the autumn, we're almost into September. It's difficult to see either of those guys, either side, changing and producing something dramatic. Now, when the weather changes in November, December, and it freezes and so forth, that's a different kettle of fish. I mean, that's now 2 or 3 months away, and things can change.
Well, again, a very sobering but important conversation, Tim. Thank you so much for chatting with me. Is there anything else that you wanted to mention before I finish the recording?
No, my only sort of final comment is the ability, inevitably, the ability of the West to hold together, and what's going to happen to energy prices over the next, winter. I am pretty clear that the UK and others, 1 or 2 others, are very strong on this, and I give credit it has to be said to Boris Johnson, who I don't have a lot of time for, but nonetheless, it had to give him credit, and particularly Ben Wallace, who I think has been a very good Secretary of State for Defence, and that we, the UK, are holding firm on this. My concern is whether the West collectively will do so. All the right words are said, but words like "it is official policy to do something," yeah, okay, well, that means there's an awful lot of conversation going on in behind closed doors, and that's the area that I'm not that confident on. But yeah, time will tell. We'll see.